Welcome back, AP. Oh, sorry. Ugh. It's still a little on the early side, right? But we are going to pick up where we left off in class. We have a lot to go over in this flip in particular. I'm going to try and keep it shorter rather than longer, but you know what, Shane Slack, no promises. Now, anyway, but getting after it, we left off here in class, right? We were talking originally about Columbus and discussing how no way. So close. Now, anyway, we were talking about how he has been overhyped in his cruelty, but he also isn't a saint, right? So we talked about how he's extremely pious, that he was Genoese, and he was actually trying to flex on Venice, basically trying to find a way to bring Genoa back to trade dominance, especially after in 1291 when their exploring Atlantic ships were all lost and things like that. He originally went to the Portuguese, he went to other city-states of Italy, he went to Spain and then asked for money, eventually finally being funded by Isabel and Ferdinand, right? 33 days later, he lands in the Bahamas, he meets the Taino, he gives them smallpox, the best gift of all time. So things like that originally, they were a non-violent people, he has them enslaved, etc., etc., etc. Something I forgot to tell y'all about, actually. Remember how I told you what percent of all of the findings was he given? If they found X amount of things, what was the agreement that he had with Isabel and Ferdinand of Spain? Very nice job, Grace. That's exactly right, 10%, right? You got 10% of everything found. So the big thing about it was, there's an old story that says if after being enslaved, if they did not harvest enough sugar, if they did not find enough gold or precious metals, if they didn't hit a quota for the day, then their hands would be cut off. Because it's like 10% of your body. The reason of it being 10% of your body is not, I just made that up. But I'm just saying, apparently this old story goes that he had, natives' hands cut off and stuff like that if they weren't collecting enough wares, and he always thought he was in Asia. He thought China was right around the corner. He thought he was going to end up meeting the Great Khan, right? Like the Mongols, even though ironically enough, by this point, the Mongols had actually been conquered by the Chinese. So a lot of different things happened. Now, he did unintentionally spread disease. He was not the big proponent of assaults directly on the natives themselves. A lot of these are hearsay. Other European powers are trumping up reasons for his cruelty, etc., etc. The colonists he brought were much worse than he was. We talked about this, right? I told you I would start off on here. He couldn't stop them from committing atrocities. A revolt breaks out. A roll of investigation is sent by the Spanish, and he is eventually sent back to Spain in chains. Control of his discovery passed the rules. He died thinking he was in China. China was right around the corner. And I don't really feel like getting into the debate about this guy. Let's be honest. He discovered things that made us what we are today, but at the same time, he didn't have to be the way that he was, right? So, but continuing forward. Now we get to get into some really, really cool stuff, all right? So, some really, really, really cool stuff. Well, first of all, we're going to talk about the late explorers and pushing in. And what I mean by pushing in is pushing into these new continents and these new areas of the world, right? Now, first and foremost, something you need to know is two very important individual pieces of information. Number one, Amerigo Vespucci, very important cat. Also, something else you need to kind of keep in mind while we're going through the rest of this stuff is a lot of the things you need to be writing down are things that I am saying, all right? Write down things you find interesting, things that you think are important, or things that you think are going to be necessary or could possibly pop up on a quiz or a test, right? Because the thing about it is if I were to write everything word for word of what things I thought you might want to write down, me as your history instructor, I think everything's important. I know all of these things. That's not me being arrogant. I'm just saying, right? So, but the thing about it is you don't necessarily need to know everything for the AP test. You need to understand the grand theme of it all, right? So one big grand theme of it all is to keep in mind, I wish I had my big gold map behind me so I could draw on it right now, but I don't. And so, but the thing about it is, remember, the Portuguese now control the Indian Ocean, India, and several other areas that are also on the eastern side of Africa after going around the Cape of Storms, thank you Bartholomew Diaz, also known as the Cape of Good Hope, and following Vasco da Gama's voyages of successful financial voyages all the way to India to find these spices. The Portuguese pretty much control everything, but everybody is now in pursuit of a chain of islands, right? They're called the Molokai Islands, also known as the Spice Islands, right? So the Molokai Islands and the Spice Islands, ironically enough, are on the far eastern side of India, right? So you have to go past India to get to these things. These were different islands that Columbus himself, if he would have actually been in Japan like he thought that he was, would have been elated to find, right? Because the Molukai Islands are packed full of crazy important spices, ranging all the way from cinnamon to pink pepper, right? So, like, this is where they are. So you got Vietnam right here, China, this is Thailand. The Molukai Islands include all of these areas, as well as the Philippines and everything like that. So, but the Molukai Islands in particular are everything here in pink. Java was a very, very important island that actually gave a lot of very important spices. This is what they were after, though. Now, really quick talking about that guy with a very, very nice beard, okay? So just keep in mind, the Molukai Islands are a thing to remember, okay? Now, really quick, Amerigo Vespucci, the man that North and South America are named for, right, was the first one, the reason why he actually had these things named after him. He's a cartographer, right, a map maker and an explorer. He was the first one to completely realize that this was not the old world. This is a completely new world. A whole new world, if you understand what I'm saying. Aladdin fans out there? No? Okay. So anyway, but Amerigo Vespucci claimed that this was a new world of new lands and new continents that had never been discovered, and he had no idea the size and scope of it all. So his proclamation of that, later on when German map makers came over, they named them after him because he was the first one to proclaim it, even though, ironically enough, Columbus discovered these new lands first, right? So he is the one that the Americas are named after. Now, this is really important, though, going into the Molukai Islands, talking about Amerigo Vespucci, realizing that these are completely new areas, then comes down this thing written by Alexander VI, the Pope at the time, right? Pope Alexander VI in the late 1400s, early 1500s, the Treaty of Tordesillas, right? Tordesillas. Now, I think that's how you say it. Now, anyway, but the Treaty of Tordesillas, or Tordesillas, you know, also known as, not freshman year, but there is a word that we use to refer to this thing. And take 2 seconds and think about it this way. It's a division down the middle of the... Oh, calm down, Kieran. I know Kieran's like stirring right now. Like, it's a division down the middle of the world. It's a line that Alexander VI had drawn to prevent Spain and Portugal from going to war with one another over these newfound areas, right? I can hear you. I hear you over there. Lucas, Jules, all you guys. The line of demarcation is what it's also known as, right? So the line of demarcation was a line of division that actually kind of is close to the modern-day prime meridian. Actually, no, it's not at all. It goes down the middle of the Atlantic, right? And it separates the old world, which was given to the Portuguese, and the new world, which was given to the Spanish, right? Now, keep in mind, this is written by a pope, which kind of sheds some light on the reason why he had this line drawn in the first place. These are both extremely Catholic countries, right? The more money they make, the more money he ends up taking off in the tithe as well. He doesn't want them going to war because if they going to war, that's a loss of funds, right? So the line of demarcation is very important. But now we got to get into Magellan and then the early French explorations, which stink anyway. Now, anyway, but let's talk about Magellan real quick. So Magellan was actually adopted in but Magellan's voyage was funded in 1519. Really quickly, something you need to know about him, he is the first man to be given credit for circumnavigating the entire globe, which means actually going all the way around it, right? Well, the thing about it is he didn't even make it. He only made it about halfway, right, before dying in the Philippines. And the reason, at the time, were the Philippines even named? No. The Philippines didn't even get their name until the 1560s when they were named actually after Philip II, the son of the man who paid this guy, right? So, wait, this guy. Him right there. Now, anyway, so Magellan actually in 1519 was funded by Charles V, the Holy Roman Empire at the time. You remember Charles, the guy that retired to the monastery and faked his own funeral, right? So the worst ruler in the worst reign possible, right? The Reformation Holy Roman Emperor funded Magellan to go and try and find these islands, the Molukai Islands, to find an easier route to them, right? Because everyone at the time in 1519 thought that the Molukai Islands were right on the other side of whatever they had hit in the New World. But no one actually realized just how big the New World was. So Magellan was going all the way around South America, and on the way around South America, 2 of his ships tried to mutiny against him. He had 5 ships and 270 men, right? So 5 ships, 270 men, and before he even makes it through the Strait of Magellan, that is now named after him at the southern tip of South America, which is extremely dangerous and very, 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 very chaotic, 2 of his ships mutinied against him. and then one of them returned to Spain. So he's cruising with only 2/5 of his, like, what's that? What's 2/5? 2/5 is like what, 40%? Isn't that 40%? 40%? Yeah. So about 40% of his crew, who is starving also at the time, going around South America, and they finally get through these terrible storms and stuff like that, and then they're eating rats and sawdust trying to stay alive, and then they end up in a new body of water that really no one had ever given a name, right? Because everybody thought it was one giant contiguous ocean, but it wasn't. Even the Asians thought that the same ocean that they sailed into is the same ocean that the Europeans were operating out of, right? So turns out, though, Magellan gave it a new name because after leaving that really, really terrible, chaotic area right under South America, he was like, wow, this place is so peaceful. I'm going to call it the Pacific, right? So the Pacific Ocean, named for its peaceful waters, right? But his crew members are eating rats and sawdust, and they finally get some new supplies in some of these islands, and then he gets into a skirmish in the Philippines, which he is then decapitated, right? And he dies in one of these skirmishes. So actually, a very undermanned crew of only 2 of his vessels actually makes it all the way back around the Cape of Good Hope and pilots its way in. So some of the first people to actually even make it all the way around were not even Magellan himself, but some of his slaves, right? So now, anyway, but he is given the credit, right? So now we got to talk about early, I know you saw him, give me a second. Early French and English explorations, first and foremost, they stunk, all right? Like, the early French and English explorations of North America particularly were from the 1490s to the 1570s, and they were terrible, right? They didn't really found anything. They kind of just piddly-popped all the way around New England, ended up in little parts of Canada. They couldn't really find anything at all. The only real advent that they actually came across was 2 items. One of them being beavers, right? Beavers and fur trapping were huge by the French, made them a lot of money. Now, well, a drop in the bucket by comparison to what Spain and Portugal was making. But it did make them some money. And then also one other thing, cod, right? There was huge, huge schools of Atlantic cod that was all over the New World. And so they would actually fish and, like, try to find, and that's their reasoning for showing up later on, right? So, but getting after it. So anyway, here we go. There we go. Now we got to get into the Spanish Conquest, right? Man, I'm a little aggravated that I didn't animate these things to show up a little later. But it's cool. They're really neat pictures. I'm going to show you. And the big guys that you're talking about when you're talking about Spanish Conquest and the pursuit of gold, it's none other than our man Hernan Cortez, right? So Hernan Cortez, Spanish explorer, right? Pictured right here in his goofy little, like, leather jerkin armor and, like, you know, set up very nicely. He decides to set out from Cuba, the new Spanish territory, with 600 men and 16 horses and 10 cannons, right? Which in the grand scheme of things is not that many, right? So, but he decides to go into Mexico to try and find what they have in there, the thing that Columbus was looking for when he saw the gold jewelry of the Taino people, and they told him, oh, the Mexicans, they got tons of this stuff, right? So he decides to venture in there. So much so that he actually pulls a stunt because the original pursuit of the entire thing was supposed to be reconnaissance, right? But we'll talk about that in a minute. But he plans to go find the Mexica Empire, right? Well, here's the thing. Mexica is what you also refer to as Aztecs, right? So when you were a freshman, I always say Aztecs because that's been the adopted name of these people for so long. The thing about it is, sorry about that. I'm trying to get a stool so I can put my feet up on it. The thing about the Mexicas, though, is that that's what we refer to them now. Because when you're talking about the Aztecs, you're talking about the singular group of people that actually created an empire known as the Mexica Empire, right? So Mexica actually includes all the people they took over. Speaking of people they took over, let's discuss these people real fast. First of all, the Aztecs are no slouches, right? Literally, the Tenochtitlan, 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 right? Their capital city was larger than any city in Europe at the time. Some people would say that it would rival ancient Rome, right? It was a massive city, home to over 1 million people, right? So absolutely humongous. It had an amazing infrastructure, roads, civic, municipal buildings, religious temples, right? Like all kinds of amazing construction. They had mathematics, oral poetry, historical accounts, written language, cartography, maps of their own. Amazing things, right? They had these amazing things that even far exceeded many, like, people in Europe that had existed for hundreds of years. These people were phenomenally intelligent. Phenomenally, right? So much so, they built their entire city on a lake, right? Like, so these people were crazy smart. They were not slouches. People try to build them all the time like they were people, like, running around, eating, like, everything from the ground, and they had nothing going for themselves. Tenochtitlan was founded on a lake, on Lake Texacoco. Texacoco, Texacoco. because their old story goes that they wandered the desert for 100 years, right? And then the gods told them, like, one of the gods was like, you will know where you are meant to found your city when you see an eagle on a cactus clutching a snake in its talons. And they saw this right outside of this lake, right? Or some say it was on the lake, on the island of which they founded their city, right? So, but the thing about it is, they ended up actually founding their city, and they did it in concentric circles, right? And they kept emanating out of it and out of it and out of it. They had entire structures, including like police enforcement, judiciary committees, like different political structures, like a monarchy that also had an entire advisory board beneath it. And then not to mention the fact that they built islands to farm on. They're called chinampas. They built islands to farm on. Does nobody realize what I'm saying here? That's amazing. This is a chinampa, all right? So because when they actually founded their area, and they built dams because the lake that they founded on had salt water in it. So they built dams to actually separate fresh rainwater and divert it in to build these chinampas on top of it. And what chinampas are these like reed mats. They would like weave these reed mats together and stack them one on top of each other and then pile mud on it and then plant a spruce tree in it to anchor it into the bottom of the lake. Because the root, like if this is the chinampa, the tree would be planted right here and then it would grow down and anchor itself in with its roots. So they used natural means of over-water farming. They're phenomenally smart. And this right here is some of their warriors. Some people, many historians believe that the only thing that really held the Aztecs back from being as powerful and as amazing as the Europeans is the lack of one thing, forged metal. All right? So the only real good forged metals that you can find in the New World was copper, and the only people really using that were the Inca. So if you look at their spears right here, the Aztecs were making all of their weapons out of obsidian, which is lava rock. It's obsidian is like, it's sharpened rock from a volcano, right? So it's very brittle. It's glass-like, but it holds an amazing edge and is very, very sharp. So they had a very organized military with really dope uniforms. Now, and those weapons that they had, not the rest of the people around them, this is how big they grew to be. This is Tenochtitlan right here, and the blue right there is the original Aztec race. They actually claimed an empire that big. It was huge. But here's the catch. The people they took over hated them. All right? They couldn't stand them, right? So mainly because the Aztecs are really big about one thing. Human sacrifice, right? Human sacrifice to prevent the onslaught of their god named Quetzalcoatl, right? Quetzalcoatl, you don't need to know how to spell that, but if you want to, it's Quetzcotl, somewhere in that region. Quetzalcoatl is supposed to be a giant white flying snake serpent that if you sacrifice to him regularly, he won't destroy the entire world, right? So they would actually, but I'll show you exactly, I'll sacrifice one of you in class on Monday, all right? I'll show you exactly how it's done, but the numbers are absolutely staggering. Like some historian, no one knows for sure, but when they actually, venerated, I guess is a word we're going to look for, or the coronation, there's a word, consecration. When they consecrated this temple, right, when they consecrated that temple, some historians believe that they sacrificed upwards of 250,000 people, right? That's one person every 14 minutes, all right? So, like I said, I'll tell you how they did it, but human sacrifice was really crazy. And where do you think they got all those humans to sacrifice from? The other people they took over, right? So the people they took over had to give agricultural products as well as humans to be sacrificed in their religious ceremonies by the Aztecs. So they were not building very good relationships with their neighbors, right? This right here, that's a jaguar jar. That's where they'd actually take the heart whenever they cut it out and stick it in there. It's very, very cool. And this is their leader, their phenomenal leader, the illustrious, believed to be a god himself, Moctezuma, or Montezuma II, if you want to call him that, right? Spelled Moctezuma, Moctezuma, right? So, well, here's the thing. Going back into this entire shenanigans, right? Sorry, I geeked out on the Aztecs there for a little bit, but because they're just so cool. The mission was supposed to be recon. The mission was supposed to be a reconnaissance mission. They were then, Cortez and his men were supposed to return back to Cuba, not refuel, but re-up on men and supplies, and then go to create relations with the new people. But when Cortez landed in Mexico, he actually burned the vessels in the harbor. He burned the boats so that no one could turn back. And he was like, we're staying and we're fighting and we're going to go get this. Let's get this bread. Now, anyway, getting after it, though, men had heard of their oncoming. The Aztecs knew that they were there. All right, everybody, like a lot of early Spanish accounts claim that they believed that we were gods and they gave us all of these things and blah, blah, blah. Not true, right? Like, they actually didn't believe that. They knew they were a new people. They were well aware, right? And they were like, well, let's send them some stuff and try to be peaceful, right? So they actually sent gifts to them. And then, like, what ends up happening is Cortez follows these gift givers back, and he goes all the way in, and he abuses the dissension within the Mexican Empire. As he's following the gift givers back in to Tenochtitlan at the capital, he realizes that these people that are under the rule of the Aztecs absolutely hate the Aztecs, right? So what he does is he begins to recruit them. He recruits all of these native tribes, and he shows up in Tenochtitlan with 200 Spanish men, but 6,000 natives and one interpreter, a female interpreter that I can never remember what her name is. Now, but Montezuma is criticized by so many historians because he welcomed the Spanish in, right? So a lot of historians believe that had they just attacked immediately, not only would they have killed all of the Spanish and probably saved their entire society, but then the onslaught of smallpox later on would have been something they would have been able to handle. You know what I mean? However, Cortez takes him hostage when negotiations break down, and they also turn to their leader. The Aztecs turn on Montezuma, and they actually attack not only him, but also the Spanish as well. And then Cortez is driven out, but unfortunately Montezuma dies in the entire thing, right? But Cortez then gets pushed out in the original one, and then his second invasion, he brings back more natives, and he ends up taking the city because smallpox ended up ruining their entire population. This right here is what a lot of Spanish actually would try to use to do the math on what all their sacrifices were, because every time they would sacrifice somebody, the Aztecs would slide the skull onto a really big rack so they could display the numbers. It's very cool. So now, that though being said, Cortez is going to destroy the entire the Aztec community pretty much. He's going to turn them into slaves, and then he plans on mining the gold beneath them, right? But now we got Pizarro in Peru, right? Francisco Pizarro. Let's talk about the Inca real quick, all right? So the Inca are another very, very, very amazing society that existed at the time. The Inca actually were 9,000 feet above sea level in the Andes Mountains in Peru, right? So very, very, very developed people. Their capital city was known as Cusco. A lot of y'all know that name from the Disney movie, right? So, but getting after it though, very, very advanced civilization. One thing they didn't have though was a written language, which I always thought was really neat. And they actually only had this. The only written language or record keeping they have was these things called quipus, and it's a series of knots that they actually tie onto a thread to keep account of different trade items, right? So the other crazy thing about them is their farming techniques, right? A lot of historians believe that the Inca had access to harder metals like copper. Not a lot of them, but some access to harder metals like copper. The only thing that prevented them from being really, really even more sophisticated than they already were was they didn't have a lot of beasts of burden, right? They had llamas that can only carry about 60 pounds worth of wares on their back, right? However, they had an amazing form of farming. This is how they farmed at high elevations. It's called terracing, right? Where they would actually cut into the surface of the dirt in a mountain, flatten it out, and make almost these stair-like structures. And they would actually plant on every single flat surface. It's an amazingly cool system of farming. The Italians did it too. Let's not pretend like the Incas are the only people doing this. The Italians in Chicotera had been doing it for hundreds of thousands of years. Well, not hundreds of thousands of years, but a long time. But the terracing systems in Peru were amazing, right? So this is another really cool thing about the Inca. A little bit different, right? I hate how people lump these native people together, right? The Peruvian Incas are very, very different. This is how the Incas sacrificed people. They sacrificed children, right? I know some of y'all are like, oh, yeah, so they actually sacrificed children. Incas would sacrifice children during times of war, disease, or famine, right? To try and reverse this natural process. They were like, oh, if we sacrifice the purest beings in all of existence, then maybe the gods will take pity on us, right? So they would sacrifice children a lot of times. They would be dressed in some of the nicest clothes that were found, and then they also would be killed in very, really messed up ways. To try and calm the kids down before being sacrificed, they would give them alcohol and make them chew on coca leaves to try and which is what cocaine is made out of, to try and calm them and stuff like that. And then they would either be strangled, suffocated, or hit over the head really, really hard, and then left in the mountains. The crazy thing about, or dying of exposure in the mountains, they would go up there and just leave them there. Craziest thing happened though. At the top of the Andes, it's so cold and so dry that their bodies, several of them were preserved. We actually have a lot of Incan sacrificial mummies. This is the best one that we have. She's perfectly preserved, right? Absolutely perfectly preserved. Inside of her mouth, they actually found a piece of coca leaf that she was chewing on when she was actually sacrificed. And some of you are probably crying right now. Please don't, all right? That's Pizarro, the guy who's going to come and take them over, and that right there is King Atahualpa, the guy that actually was leading the Inca when Pizarro showed up, right? Well, the Inca were very weak at the time from civil war and disease. Some people believe that, well, first of all, so smallpox hit the Incans before the Spanish had ever even shown up, probably due to wind drifts or the fact that the old world people were now there and it was traveling through animals and different things like that, right? But disease had hit them pretty hard, and they were also having a civil war, possibly over secession of Atahualpa, deciding actually who's going to take the throne, and Atahualpa's forces ended up winning, right? Well, Atahualpa, same thing, is not as dumb as history likes to try and write him down as sometimes. Atahualpa was well aware that the Spanish were on their way, right? So he sent envoys to actually greet them, and he was like, oh, here's some gifts, right? Meh. So he then amassed 7,000 of his own troops, and he planned on trapping the Spanish, right? He planned on actually bringing them in and greeting them, being like, oh, hey, what's up, bros? And then jumping them and actually ambushing them all at once. Well, it didn't go as they had planned, and what ended up happening is the Spaniards actually captured Atahualpa using guns, cannons, and horses, their big, like, 3 advantages that the Incans were not even aware of, and they ransomed Atahualpa, a huge ransom at that. The Incans paid it, and then they executed him right after the fact. So, like, the Spaniards were very, very, very grotesquely mean. But the Spaniards stumbled also upon, the big thing about the Incas, they stumbled upon a fortune of gold and silver that the Incans had already mined for them, right? So this right there, this is a digitized replication of what we believe the interior of the Temple of the Sun in the Incan capital of Cusco looked like. It literally is covered wall to wall in gold, right? So the Spaniards realized they're about to make a lot of money. Right? So let's talk really, really quickly about, like, well, the Spanish are now there, right? So what are they going to do? Well, first of all, they got to set up administration, right? So what they're going to do is they're going to divide the colonies up into 4 separate viceroyalties, which are actually provincial states. And a viceroy rules over them, like an administrator, right? So now, before Columbus, historians predict, better question, what's the point, right? Why are we there? Why did the Spanish decide to stay there? Well, there's money to be made, right? That's our big gold motivation, right? We know the God motivation was let's find some lost Christians and also try to, like, prevent the Turkish threat. And then also let's convert everybody we can find. The gold motivation, though, is the biggest one out of all of them. Glory kind of comes as an after-the-fact kind of thing. But gold was huge because historians predict that there was a population of about 50 million that actually existed at the time of the Spanish Conquest, right? So, silver was discovered by the Spanish, sugar was planted, livestock was ranched, but here's the problem. In these 4 provincial states called viceroyalties, who the heck's going to work all these things? All you've got is a bunch of poor Spaniards that you didn't even want back home in the first place, right? Well, they established this thing called the encomienda, right? The encomienda system was when Spanish granted the colonies the right to force natives to work for free, right? So it was a free slavery system. Now, major loss of life, though, due to disease, smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, and also overwork, right? So last thing we'll talk about really, really quickly is just, this is it, yep. So you can kind of pause me real quick or whatever, but I'm going to run through this real fast, not stay here too long, because I don't like talking about the English and the French colonies that much, right? So English and French are then going to continue to try and push in after their crappy investigative purposes during the 1520s, and they're like, there's got to be something out there, right? So they decide to actually focus on North America still. The early English ones hug the Atlantic coast. Their early settlements are, of course, Roanoke and Jamestown, right? Roanoke. You get this clip art? Roanoke went up in smoke, but Jamestown made its money off tobacco. If you don't draw that cigarette in this flip, I'm going to be upset. All right, so now, anyway, really quick, Plymouth, Massachusetts, Maryland, and Pennsylvania will then be founded later on for religious purposes, right? So Plymouth, a separatist colony of Anglicans, right? Or not Anglicans, separatist colony of Puritans running away from the Anglicans, right? So that's your John Winthrop and, what's her name? Anne Hutchinson, those are major figures there. Massachusetts, the Bay Colony, would be actually grown out of that Plymouth colony, or actually founded a little bit later. I think it's like 1620. So Maryland actually was founded as a refuge for Catholics coming from England, right? Mary's Land, Lord Baltimore founded that guy. You know a lot of this stuff may be U.S. already. And then Pennsylvania was founded by the Quakers. Now, the French are going to push into Canada, right? Their big ones are going to be Canada, the Mississippi River, Louisiana, coffee grounds, and Louisiana. Their early settlements are, of course, Montreal, Quebec, Louisiana, and the islands in the West Indies, right? That they also refer to, put next to this right here, referred to as the Sugar Islands, right? So Louisiana, so Montreal, Quebec, and Louisiana are known as, first of all, Louisiana is known as the Crescent City, but Montreal and Quebec, because they're French. I couldn't find a croissant clip art, so I just put this crescent moon, get it? Croissant. Now, anyway, but Montreal, Quebec, and Louisiana are early French colonies, right? Now, something to keep in mind, the French colonies were not nearly as big or robust as the English ones were, right? And not making nearly as much money. But regardless, the French and Indian War is going to break out. It's going to be known as the 7 Years' War. You already know that. Fighting over the borders between these colonies, right? So France is going to end up losing. And they end up losing Canada, Louisiana, but they're going to keep the West Indies, right? Ironically enough, Louisiana was given back to the French in 1800 in a peace treaty, but then Napoleon turned around and sold it in 1803. Nice job, guy. Way to make some good money there. But yeah, that's where we're going to end. I know this one was long, but I really geek out over these native people. I think they're so cool, and I hope you did too, and I hope you were kind of just like listening along and actually enjoyed those little segments. But yeah, so that's going to be it for this weekend, and I'll see you guys on Monday. Y'all have a great evening, or excuse me, great weekend. And unfortunately, can't say go Birds because it's a bye week, but, you know, go anybody that's playing anyone in the NFC East. Hopefully they lose. All right, so y'all have a great weekend, though. I'll see y'all on Monday.